North Hatley exists in that particular Canadian way. Pristine enough to photograph well, small enough that everyone knows the precise dimensions of everyone else's business. The town clings to the northern shore of Lake Massawippi like something precious, its grand houses sprawling along the waterfront where Montreal's doctors and lawyers retreat each summer to pretend they're different people. For the first 7 years of my life, I believed this was normal, that every child grew up watching sailboats drift past their bedroom window, that every neighborhood smelled like pine and money and fresh water. Then, the day after my 7th birthday, a woman I'd never seen before tried to murder me. The summer of 1957 came hot and relentless. The kind of heat that makes the lake shimmer like something alive, that drives children into the water every 20 minutes just to remember what cool feels like. Our house sat close to the shore, no backyard to speak of, just a dock extending into the lake like an invitation. The front lawn, though, stretched wide and green, separated from the lake path by perhaps 10 feet of nothing. That's where we were playing when we saw the car. 3 of us, all boys, all wearing swimming trunks that dripped lake water onto the grass as we chased each other in circles. The game didn't matter. Tag, maybe, or some variation we'd invented and would forget by tomorrow. What mattered was the movement, the shouting, the particular freedom of being 7 years old in summer with the whole afternoon stretching ahead. The lake path ran past our house, and cars used it constantly, but they always drove slowly, respectfully, because everyone knew everyone, and no one wanted to be the person who almost hit the Henderson boy or the Martin girl. We'd learned to recognize vehicles by sound alone. Mr. Peterson's truck with its rattling exhaust, Mrs. Chen's sedan that purred like it was falling asleep. This car was unfamiliar. A pale green Dodge Regent that caught the sunlight and threw it back at us in sharp angles. We stopped playing to watch it approach, the way children do, curious about anything that breaks the pattern of their day. The car was perhaps 100 yards away when I noticed it accelerating. I can't explain how I knew. Some instinct older than thought, some animal understanding that the sound the engine was making, that rising whine of mechanical strain, meant danger. I took a step backward, then another. My friends must have felt it too, because we all moved at once, our bodies understanding before our minds could form the words. The Regent's engine roared. The car veered off the lake path and onto our lawn, tires tearing through grass, heading directly toward us at a speed that seemed impossible for something so close. We ran. I don't remember deciding to run, just the sudden explosive motion of my legs carrying me away from that green metal thing that wanted to crush us. Behind me, the engine screamed. The whole world reduced to the sound of that approaching car and the knowledge that it was gaining, that running might not be enough. If the driver had been sober, we'd be dead. That's what I understand now. But she was drunk enough that her hands couldn't quite make the steering wheel obey her intentions. The Regent missed us by feet, close enough that I felt the heat of it passing, and slammed into the oak tree in Mr. Finster's front yard with a sound like the world ending. The impact was catastrophic. The front of the car crumpled inward, the hood buckling up and over itself. The tree shuddered, but held. For a moment, everything was silent, except for the ticking of the ruined engine and the hiss of escaping steam. Then, the driver's door opened and she got out. Blood covered her face, running down from a gash across her forehead and soaking into her white blouse until it looked tie-dyed in red. She couldn't have been more than 30, pretty in a way that made the blood seem more obscene. She stood there swaying slightly, one hand on the car for balance, and I thought she might collapse. Hoped she might collapse. One of my friends called out, "Lady, are you okay?" The kind of stupid question you ask when reality hasn't caught up with what your eyes are showing you. She turned toward us, and her eyes. I'd never seen hatred before. Not real hatred, the kind that lives in a person's chest like a second heart, pumping poison instead of blood. But I saw it then, focused entirely on me with an intensity that made everything inside me go cold and small. A neighbor across the street shouted something. I heard her voice, Mrs. Peterson maybe, or Mrs. Wu, high and frightened. The woman at the car turned away from us, moving toward the passenger side with jerky, determined movements. When she pulled the shotgun from the passenger seat, I didn't understand what I was looking at. Guns were hunting rifles that hung over fireplaces, or cap guns that came in cowboy holster sets. This was neither of those things. Just a long wooden stock and 2 metal barrels that she swung in my direction with hands that shook but didn't waver. The first shot went wide. I don't know where the buckshot ended up, in the ground, in a tree, scattered across Mr. Finster's lawn. I just know that one moment there was silence, and the next there was an explosion of sound that turned the world into ringing emptiness. We ran for my house. My mother wasn't home. She and my older sister had gone for a walk and told us, but we'd been too excited about playing to listen. At the time, this seemed like the worst possible luck. Now I understand it was probably what saved their lives. The door was locked. We pounded on it anyway, some desperate part of us hoping that maybe someone would answer, that maybe we were wrong and safety was just on the other side of this wooden barrier. Behind us, I could hear the woman coming, not running, her injuries made running impossible, but moving with single-minded purpose across the lawn. We abandoned the door and ran for the dock. It was the only option left. The lake stretched before us like an escape route, and we hit the water in a confused tangle of limbs and panic just as the second shot boomed across the yard. The sound underwater was different, muted and strange, more pressure than noise. I stayed under as long as I could, convinced I'd been hit and just couldn't feel it yet. Only when my lungs began to burn did I surface, gasping, certain I was about to die. Mr. Carlson had the woman on the deck. I saw them through eyes blurred by lake water and fear, him wresting the shotgun from her hands, tossing it into the lake where it landed with a splash that seemed too small for something so terrible. She was screaming, words I couldn't make out over the ringing in my ears, fighting him even though she could barely stand. He got her down to the wooden planks and held her there, calling out to ask if anyone was hurt. We weren't. Somehow, impossibly, we weren't. Another neighbor arrived, carrying a hunting rifle, not understanding the threat was already neutralized. Mr. Carlson sent him to call the police, then told us to get back to the house and stay out of sight. We obeyed immediately. The woman screaming followed us around the building, wordless and raw, and filled with something that sounded almost like grief. My mother returned to find police cars in the driveway and her youngest son wrapped in a towel, shaking. The hysteria that followed was understandable. One moment she'd been walking with my sister, enjoying the summer afternoon. The next, she was learning that a stranger had tried to run down her child and shoot him when that failed. The guilt consumed her. She kept saying she should have been there, should have protected us, even though being there would have likely meant dying there. The truth came out slowly, in pieces, the way terrible truths always do. The woman was named Sarah Benchley. She and my father had been having an affair for 18 months. He'd promised to leave us, promised to abandon his wife and 3 children for a new life with her. Then he changed his mind, decided he was better off where he was.
Sarah had threatened to kill his family. My father's response was essentially, "No, you won't." He didn't believe her, didn't take her seriously, didn't think she'd actually get drunk on her father's whiskey, take his shotgun, and drive across town to murder 3 children in their front yard. The police told my father first. He didn't tell my mother the whole story, just that Sarah had some kind of obsession with him, that it wasn't his fault, that these things just happened sometimes. My mother found out anyway. Small towns are good at keeping secrets right up until they're not. The fight that followed was the worst I'd ever heard, the last I ever heard too, because shortly afterward, my mother packed our things and took us south to New York City. We lived in Manhattan for several years before she remarried and we moved to Long Island with our new stepfather. We got the rest of the story in fragments over the years. Sarah went to prison. My father stayed in North Hatley, alone, and began drinking with the kind of commitment that suggested he was trying to poison something inside himself that wouldn't die. He succeeded eventually. Liver failure, they said. I was 17 when I heard he'd died, and I felt nothing. Not grief, not relief, just a distant acknowledgement that the man who'd almost gotten me killed by being unable to keep his pants on had finally faced a consequence he couldn't talk his way out of. Sometimes I wonder about those final days, whether he thought about us, whether the memories of what he'd set in motion tortured him, or whether he found just the right combination of alcohol and self-pity to numb it all into nothing. I try not to feel too sorry for him. There's an alternate timeline where his selfishness and cowardice result in 4 fresh graves, where Sarah's aim was better, or she was sober enough to turn the wheel a few degrees more, or she arrived 30 seconds earlier when we were standing closer to the road. In that timeline, my father gets to drink himself to death next to the graves of his children and wife. And honestly, that seems about right. I survived because I stepped backward, because some instinct I can't name told me to move before my conscious mind understood why, because a drunk woman's hands couldn't quite manage the precision murder required. But here's what stays with me, what I can't shake even now, decades later. The look in her eyes when she locked onto me, that pure, undiluted hatred directed at a 7-year-old boy who'd never done anything to her except exist as evidence of my father's other life. I was a problem to be solved, an obstacle to happiness, and she'd decided that obstacles could be removed with sufficient speed and shotgun shells. I think about that sometimes when I hear about crimes of passion, about people who just snapped. Sarah Benchley didn't snap. She made a plan, got drunk for courage, took weapons, drove across town, and executed that plan with deadly intent. She just failed. And my father, who set all of this in motion, who lied to everyone and nearly got his children murdered, he got to live another 20 years before his body finally gave up on him. Sometimes I think that's the real horror. Not the woman with the shotgun or the car trying to run us down, but the fact that the person most responsible faced the least immediate consequences and got to spend 2 decades slowly destroying himself while the rest of us lived with what he'd done. My grandfather came to Glasgow in the 1940s when he was barely old enough to understand why. The war needed bodies and ammunition, and his father took work at the munitions factory where bodies became ammunition, or helped make it at least. They left behind Strone, a small coastal village whose name derives from the Scottish Gaelic for nose, which makes sense if you look at the peninsula on a map and have the kind of imagination that sees faces in geography. I visited Strone with my grandfather years later. He was old then, moving slowly, his memories sharper than his vision. The village was exactly as he'd described it, beautiful in that particular Scottish way, where charm and melancholy occupy the same space. Stone cottages, winding roads, the sea stretching grey and endless, golf courses where wealthy men came to pretend they were different people for a weekend. We drank whiskey that night. Too much whiskey, the kind of drinking that loosens the hinges on doors you're supposed to keep closed. And that's when he told me about the fire at Strone's post office and what really happened in 1906. Before the First World War consumed everything, Strone was precisely what it appeared to be, a charming village where nothing much happened and everyone liked it that way. The golf course brought money. The locals said hello when they passed each other. The constable had so little to do that his main occupation seemed to be whistling while he walked. Then, one October evening, the post office burned. The fire was visible from miles away, they said, the whole building engulfed, flames reaching high enough to stain the night sky orange. The townspeople fought bravely with bucket brigades and prayer, but the post office burned to its foundation by dawn. The constable, a man named Mallister, feared the worst.
The postmaster, Mr. Douglas, and his two assistants, Mrs. Robertson and Mrs. Mackenzie, had been inside when the fire started. All three were unmarried. All three lived in quarters connected to the post office. All three should have been in there when the flames came.
Mallister enlisted 2 trusted men to sift through the ashes with him. They worked in early morning silence, dreading what they might find. They found nothing. No bodies, no bones, no evidence anyone had died in that fire. Mallister announced this to the village with carefully measured words. The postmaster and his assistants appeared to have absconded with over £1,000 from the post office savings bank. All 3 had fled, taking the town's money with them. The scandal was immediate and total. This was the most significant crime Strone had seen in 2 centuries. The last time blood had been spilled was in the 1700s, when smugglers martyred a customs officer on the beach. At church the following Sunday, Mallister addressed the congregation. He was working tirelessly to bring the thieves to justice, he said. Police in Glasgow and Belfast were cooperating. Officers in Glasgow believed they were close to finding the trio. A week later, Mallister had more news. Police had raided a house in Clydebank, just missing the fugitives, but they'd left behind a bag full of banknotes. The stolen money had been recovered. The village celebrated. The pub landlords facilitated, profiting from both scandal and resolution. It was all a lie. The truth didn't emerge for 25 years. Mallister died of cancer before he could confess, taking the secret to his grave as he'd intended. But one of his 2 trusted helpers, one of the men who'd helped sift through the ashes, couldn't carry it to his own. On his deathbed, consumed by guilt, he told his family what really happened that October morning. They had found bodies, 3 of them. The postmaster and both assistants, burned beyond easy recognition, but unmistakably human remains. What confused them was why the victims hadn't escaped. The post office was small. They would have noticed a fire immediately. But both doors were locked from the inside, and the keys were in the postmaster's clothing, melted partially into what remained of his body. Mallister left the other 2 men to guard the scene while he went to Douglas's residence to look for an explanation. He found it on the kitchen table. A note, long, rambling, written in Douglas's distinctive hand. My grandfather said Mallister described it as the most disturbing thing he'd ever read. The postmaster claimed his 2 assistants were no longer who they claimed to be, that they posed a significant threat to Strone and the wider world, that their power meant they couldn't be confronted directly. So Douglas had locked them in the post office with him, set the building on fire, kept them from escaping as they all died from smoke inhalation. He called them beings, not women, beings. Mallister made a decision in that kitchen. If word spread about what the postmaster had done, that he'd murdered 2 women because of some delusional fear, it would destroy Strone in ways the village couldn't recover from. The scandal would be permanent. Tourism would vanish, the golf course would empty, journalists would descend like carrion birds. Children would grow up in a town synonymous with madness and murder. And above all, the hauntings would begin. Not literal ghosts, though some would claim to see those too, but the haunting that comes from collective trauma. Rumors that would grow and mutate, stories that would be told and retold until they became more real than the truth. So Mallister covered it up, created the story about the theft and the recovery of the money, sacrificed the reputations of 3 dead people to save the reputation of a village. The dying man's confession spread slowly. Years of whispers in kitchens and pubs passed from family to family like an heirloom no one wanted but everyone kept. Many dismissed it as ghastly rumor, children making up stories, but my grandfather believed it, swore by it. And he had proof, he said. The year before his family moved to Glasgow, someone dug up Mrs. Mackenzie's grave, did it in the middle of the night, must have taken hours of labor, removed the coffin lid and left both it and the displaced earth visible for anyone to see. Mrs. Mackenzie's grave was empty. The remains that should have been there, the remains of a woman who supposedly died in a fire, had never been buried there at all. My grandfather told me this and then fell silent,
drinking his whiskey and staring at nothing. I wanted to ask questions, but the look on his face suggested the conversation was over. Here's what I think about sometimes. Malister made a choice to preserve the peace, to protect a village from a truth that would poison it. Maybe that was the right choice. Maybe it was monstrous. But somewhere in Strone, there's a grave with a headstone bearing Mrs. Mackenzie's name. And beneath that stone, there's nothing but empty earth. And somewhere else, in a building that burned over a century ago, a man locked 2 women inside and set the whole thing on fire because he believed they weren't human anymore. Was he insane? Almost certainly. But then why was Mrs. Mackenzie's coffin empty? The question sits in my mind like a splinter I can't remove. And I think that's exactly why McAllister covered it up, not to hide murder, but to hide a question that has no good answer. Some secrets aren't meant to protect the guilty. They're meant to protect everyone else from having to know that sometimes reality bends in ways it shouldn't. That sometimes the explanation that makes the least sense is the one that's true. I've never been back to Strone. My grandfather died years ago. The village continues being beautiful and charming and utterly normal. And somewhere beneath a headstone in its cemetery, there's an empty grave that no one talks about. Except in whispers, in kitchens, late at night after too much whiskey. When the doors that should stay closed start creaking open. I cannot tell you my current location or my real name. Even now, years after I escaped, the fear of being found remains sharp and immediate. But I can tell you about growing up in what the outside world would call a cult, and what we were taught to call the faithful remnant. I can tell you about the winter my grandmother was murdered by my grandfather, and how everyone watched it happen in the name of God. Rural Minnesota in the late 1980s and early 1990s had a particular quality of isolation that made reality seem negotiable. The plains stretched endless in all directions, and in winter, the snow created a white void where the earth met the sky with no clear boundary. We lived on a farm complex miles from anything. No neighbors, no town, no contact with the outside world except when absolutely necessary. My grandfather led our community. Shepherd, he called himself. We numbered perhaps 30 people total. My immediate family, a few other families, all living according to his increasingly rigid interpretation of Scripture. Television existed in our world, but only faith-based programming. Church happened every day and twice on Sundays. Even our Commodore 64 computer could only run games based on Bible stories. We lived in a snow globe, he'd say, separate from the corrupted world, protected by our faithfulness from the end times that were always just around the corner. Mornings began at 5:30 a.m. in the big barn that the men had painted black and converted into a chapel. We prayed for protection from the tribulation. We prayed for the sick, because my grandfather rejected all modern medicine as the devil's crutch. To use it meant wearing your lack of faith like a badge. I watched this theology kill 2 children before I was 10 years old. Small coffins lowered into frozen ground while my grandfather declared it God's will. But I also watched my little brother survive pneumonia through nothing but prayer and laying on of hands, and my grandfather declared that a miracle. So which truth did I believe? The one where faith healed, or the one where faith killed? Both. Neither. The contradiction lived in my chest like something alive. The outside world was worldly, meaning corrupt, fallen, dangerous. We had no birth certificates, no social security numbers, no official existence. My father's generation was the last to have such things. We didn't report births or deaths to the county. We avoided taxes through methods I never understood. Outsiders were to be pitied and evangelized from a distance, but never trusted or mingled with. Life had moments of joy. Summer meant berry picking and swimming in the creek, bonfires where we sang hymns and shared testimonies. But it also meant constant awareness that the end times were upon us, that the government wanted to destroy us, that Satan worked through every institution beyond our gates. I was 14 when everything changed. My grandmother attacked my grandfather with a kitchen knife. That's the official story, that she went at him with no warning, no provocation, purely possessed by demons. I think he said something to her, something that finally broke whatever had been holding her together for decades. But I'll never know what it was. What I do know is that I saw the men dragging her to the chapel. She was fighting and screaming and trying to bite them, so they wrapped cloth around her head. I only recognized her by her dress. The sound she made was inhuman, raw and desperate, and completely without language. My mother told me grandmother had been possessed by a demon. We were going to pray it out of her. I believed we would succeed. We'd saved my brother, hadn't we? Surely God would save my grandmother. They chained her to a bed in the Black Chapel. My grandfather stayed with her day and night, reading scripture, laying hands on her, commanding the demon to depart. The rest of us prayed in our homes, as we could no longer use the chapel. During the day, she mostly slept, but at night, she screamed. Every night for weeks, from darkness until dawn, we listened to my grandmother's voice echoing across the compound. Sometimes words, sometimes just raw sound. Always terrible, always there. I was certain she'd recover. Faith had worked before. Why wouldn't it work now? But she got worse. One morning, my grandfather returned from the chapel looking destroyed, pale, deflated, terrified in a way I'd never seen him. He told my father he'd learned something during the night, something that changed everything. Here's where theology becomes horror. Leviathan is one of the 7 demon princes of hell. The Bible describes it as having impenetrable scales and breathing fire. From a fundamentalist perspective, this makes Leviathan the absolute worst demon to be fighting, nearly impossible to drive out, highly corrosive to the host. But the Bible also prophesies that Leviathan will be served to the righteous at the end of days. My grandfather believed God had given him the honor of defeating this demon prince and bringing about the rapture. When my grandmother didn't improve, when weeks of prayer and fasting and laying on of hands accomplished nothing, my grandfather realized the terrible truth. God had abandoned him. And if God had abandoned him, then God had abandoned all of us. I didn't know any of this then, but I felt it. We all felt it. The fear that radiated from my grandfather in his sermons, the exhaustion in his face, the desperate quality of his prayers. Finally, he had us encircle the chapel, every man, woman, and child holding hands, praying aloud for my grandmother's soul. She screamed through the whole thing, yelling that he was the devil, that we needed to get away, to run far away from here. At the time, we thought we were hearing a demon speak. Now I think we were hearing the sanest words spoken on that compound in decades. After the prayer circle, we went home to pray more before dinner. We ate in silence, trying not to hear the sounds coming from the chapel. My grandfather had started beating her, you see, trying to literally beat the devil out of his wife. Eventually, they told us it was time to say goodbye. We lined up outside the chapel and entered in small groups. My grandmother was on the mattress, too weak to scream anymore. She looked at us but didn't seem to see us. Her eyes were blank, absent, like something had been removed from behind them. We said our tearful goodbyes while my grandfather stood watch, empty-eyed and defeated. She died shortly after. We buried her in the small cemetery we maintained for members who died without official records. My grandfather went into a period of deep prayer. He spent every day in the chapel, kneeling by that mattress where his wife had died. We thought he was praying for her soul. I think he was starving himself and contemplating what he'd become.
One morning, he walked into the woods and never returned. My father claimed angels had taken him to be with grandmother. I think he probably hanged himself from a tree, or walked until exposure killed him, or found some other way to exit a life that had become unbearable.
My father took over leadership. Things got gradually more lax. They needed a lawyer, and I was the oldest and smartest kid, so they decided to send me to college. A private Christian school, of course, but college nonetheless. It destroyed my worldview completely. Even in that restricted environment, I encountered ideas that made everything I'd been taught collapse. Gnosticism, Manichaeism, theological frameworks that suggested my grandfather hadn't been hearing God at all. The more I learned, the more I understood that my grandmother hadn't died. She'd been murdered, slowly, with everyone's knowledge and participation. The police were useless. By the time I reported it, years had passed. My grandfather was dead. No body, no evidence, no witnesses willing to testify. They told me there was very little chance of gaining convictions. I wasn't surprised, but telling them felt necessary anyway. My parents started sending letters to my college mailbox, angry letters, then pleading ones. I denied everything until I'd finished my education and saved enough money to pay the school back. Only then did I tell them the truth. I'd tried to have them arrested for murdering my grandmother. I couldn't do it in person. I wrote a letter and added that I was moving somewhere they'd never find me. I sent them a check to cover what they'd spent on my education. They cashed it. That was our last transaction. I still believe in God, though not in any way my grandfather would recognize. I pray for my parents most nights. Not every night, but most. I don't know if they've changed or if the compound even exists anymore. What I do know is that I can't reconcile with a man who helped murder his own mother, who chained her to a bed and let her scream for weeks until she died from some combination of starvation, dehydration, physical abuse, and despair. They thought they were fighting demons. They thought they were faithful. But all I see when I remember that time is a woman locked in darkness, screaming for help that never came, while everyone who claimed to love her stood outside and prayed to the very God who'd apparently abandoned her. The real horror isn't that demons exist, it's that people can convince themselves that anything, any amount of cruelty, any degree of suffering is justified if it's done in God's name. My grandmother screamed that my grandfather was the devil, that we needed to run. She was right, and we all stood there praying while he killed her. I cannot tell you my name or my exact location. The fear of being found is not paranoia when you've lived what I've lived. But I can tell you about Pashina, a small Siberian village where I grew up, where 500 people lived as our ancestors had for generations, where the winters dropped to 40 degrees below zero, and summer brought clouds of mosquitoes and midnight sun that lasted for days. We survived. That was what life in Pashina meant. Survival. Chopping wood in winter, tending gardens in summer, maintaining cars that had to run all night or their engines would freeze solid. I was the oldest daughter in a family of 5 children, which meant I helped with everything. Milking cows, feeding chickens, baking bread in our traditional brick stove. School was a one-room building kilometers away. We learned mathematics, Russian literature, and history, though our history was an odd mixture of Soviet propaganda and horror stories from the 1990s when everything collapsed after perestroika. After school, I helped tend the garden in summer, or mended clothes by candlelight in winter. We had little. Internet didn't reach us until 2011, and even then only at the community center. Electricity was unreliable. Blackouts were common. Sometimes there was no television or radio at all, just silence and the sound of wind across empty land. As a teenager, seeing pictures online of cities like Novosibirsk or Moscow made me ache with longing, but opportunities for Siberian children were few. We were born into survival, and most of us died there too. Then, one night in the winter of 2022, everything changed. The explosion woke the entire village, a boom so loud and so high in the sky that it seemed impossible, like the clouds themselves had detonated. Then the shockwave hit, rattling every building, making windows crack and children cry in their beds. My father rushed outside in his boots and coat. We all did, some not bothering with shoes or proper clothing. And when we looked up, we saw hell. A fireball filled the sky, enormous, unthinkable. It lit the night like the sun had fallen, flames so bright they hurt to look at. We stood in the snow, staring, unable to process what our eyes were showing us. The flames burned out slowly, replaced by smoke so thick it blocked the moon completely. Then, the debris started falling.
Small pieces first, pattering off our roofs like rain. Then larger pieces. Then pieces that screamed as they burned through the air. We took cover in our homes. My parents used their bodies to shield us as metal crashed through our roof. My father soaked a blanket and threw it over flaming debris before our whole house could catch fire. He saved our home. Others weren't so lucky. 8 people died that night. Nearly twice as many homes burned to the ground. By morning, Pashina looked like a war zone. Debris everywhere, buildings destroyed, the ground scorched and torn. We expected no help from the government, not for weeks or months. We were used to taking care of ourselves. When the soldiers arrived that same day, we were shocked and grateful. But they weren't there to help us rebuild. They were there to take us away. It was too dangerous to stay, they explained. They'd arranged a camp where we'd be fed and treated until it was safe to return. This seemed reasonable, even generous. The camp was good at first. Clean, organized, medical staff treated our wounded. Officers interviewed us with sympathy and care, asking what we'd seen, what we'd experienced. But then the medical examinations started. Blood draws, physical examinations, tests that happened again and again and again. Everyone was tested, not just the injured. They were looking for something. They wouldn't tell us what. After 3 weeks, we demanded to go home. The officers said Pashina wasn't ready yet, still being rebuilt by Army engineers. My father pointed out that repairs should take a week at most if everyone worked together, yet Army engineers had supposedly been working for 3 weeks with nothing to show for it. The officers said they'd figure something out. Instead of returning us to Pashina, they moved us to Mytishi, a suburb outside Moscow. A massive apartment block surrounded by others like it, except ours had fences and guards, medical facilities on the ground floor, and while we were supposedly free to come and go, leaving required military approvals that were essentially impossible to obtain. The routine continued. Military food, more medical tests, more interviews asking the same questions about what we'd seen in the sky. Explosion, fireball, debris, terror. I told them this over and over. There was nothing more to tell, but they kept asking, like they were waiting for me to say something specific. We were told Pashina was being rebuilt. Then we were told it was finished, but they still found reasons to keep us in that apartment block. My father applied for leaving permits again and again. Each time they found reasons to deny him. My mother cried one night, asking if we'd ever be allowed to leave. Then my father came home smiling. He'd found 2 guards doing something they shouldn't have been doing. He never told me what. They asked what he wanted to keep quiet. He told them he wanted to leave with his family. My mother thought it was a trick, that they'd murder him. But his leaving permit was approved. We were only the 3rd family granted permission to leave. Another man who'd been released warned my father. Things weren't over for us. He'd been followed constantly since leaving the apartment block. Someone was always watching. My father made a decision then. We would leave Russia entirely and seek asylum in another country. I can't tell you which country, for our safety, but we were granted a hearing based on claims of medical experimentation. The person who interviewed us was appalled by what we'd been through. We've been waiting a long time for our application to be processed. We're confident asylum will be granted. But I have two fears that never leave me. The first, that we'll be denied and forced to wait somewhere else for years, like we waited in the camp and the apartment. The second, larger fear, that Russia will come for us. I don't know what fell from the sky that night. I don't know what the soldiers were testing us for, what they were looking for in our blood. I don't know why 8 people had to die, why our village was destroyed, why we were imprisoned and studied and watched.
But I know that Russia wanted us contained, that they didn't want us returning to Pashina, that something happened in that sky over our village that the government considers worth hiding. And I know that secrets like that don't stay buried when witnesses escape. Sometimes I dream about that fireball, see it burning in the sky, impossibly large, impossibly bright, feel the shockwave hitting again, rattling my bones. Sometimes I dream about the apartment block, about the endless medical tests, about soldiers following my father through Moscow streets. And sometimes I dream about what would have happened if we'd never been granted that leaving permit, if we'd stayed in that building forever, tested and studied and kept like specimens until whatever they were looking for finally manifested in our bodies. I think about the other families still there, wonder if they're still waiting, still hoping for permits that will never come. We got out. We were lucky. But luck doesn't feel like enough when you're still looking over your shoulder, still jumping at unexpected sounds, still wondering if the knock at the door will be someone come to take you back. The sky fell on Pashina that night. Something came down from the darkness and changed everything. And somewhere in Russia, in a government facility I'll never see, someone knows exactly what that something was. And they're very, very interested in making sure nobody else ever finds out.